Today I stand here and say without any equivocation that David Malouf is probably the most significant living Australian writer. He's poet, novelist, short story writer, dramatist, essayist, lecturer, even librettist. He's received both critical and popular acclaim for his works, winning a number of national and international prizes. And I'm going to go through them to assure you that it's all worth the entry fee. An Imaginary Life won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award in '79. Flyaway Peter won the Age Book of the Year Award in '82. The Great World won the Miles Franklin Award and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Fiction in 1991. Remembering Babylon won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award in '93. In '94 was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, won the Miles Franklin Prize, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize Asia Pacific Region and the Prix Féminin Étranger, and was awarded the first International Impact Dublin Literary Award, the world's largest literary award, in 1996. Conversations at Curlew Creek was nominated for the Age Book of the Year Award in '96 and Miles Franklin Award in '97. He was awarded the Newstat International Prize for Literature in 2000. He won the inaugural Asia Australia Literary Award and the Prime Minister's Literary Award in 2008. His latest novel, Ransom, has been shortlisted for the Premier's Literary Award, called the Christina Stead Prize, for the third time. And if he wins it, he'll be only the second person in Australia to win it 3 times. But unlike another Australian novelist whose publisher once remarked that he had more prizes than readers, David is both widely read and greatly loved. And his novels are still in print, which is no mean effort for an Australian novelist. And let's face it, one reason that he is widely read is that his novels are great to set on courses because they're so rich in cultural complexity. Now, in fact, there are few writers who address so forcefully and incisively the enduring issues of Australian cultural life, and this was indicated by his 1998 Boyer Lectures on ABC Radio, which explore how living in one hemisphere and inheriting our culture from another affects who we are and the sort of world we make for ourselves in Australia. And indeed, there are few authors more amenable to a post-colonial reading in Australia. Malouf canvasses the entire range of issues that affect a society inheriting one culture and struggling to develop its own. The issue of language and its relation to place, the struggle that occurs within an inherited language, the creation of place and its relation to identity, the society's relation to its Indigenous people, the project of imagining and representing a world freed of its colonial inheritance, the anxieties of Australia seeking a place in the world in 2 world wars. These issues and many more define the unique skills of a writer who can balance the large cultural picture with the most intimate and finely worked detail. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present you with Australia's foremost living novelist, David Malouf.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here in this very beautiful building, I must say, and to be talking at this university. I'm a writer these days who is much more concerned with writing than with publishing. And I think a writer should always be more concerned with writing than publishing. You eventually get round to the publishing, but the writing is something you do because you are driven to do it for whatever reason, and you do it for yourself. So I should say about this book, Ransom, which was published last year, and much spoken about as my first novel for 14 years, that in fact I wrote it in 2002, and it was finished, I think, by the end of 2002. And I did then what I've done almost all my life with things that I've recently written. I put it away. It was a book I wrote very much for myself because there were things there that I wanted to write about, and I'll say something about that in a moment. But I also said to myself that I wasn't quite sure that it was a book that other people would be interested in, especially people who would look at the book and say, well, how does this fit into the rest of his work? And why are we as Australian readers in 2003, as it might have been, being asked to interest ourselves in the Iliad? I then, as I say, put the book away. I went back to my usual cache of unfinished stories and finished a book of stories which came out almost immediately after that, which was Every Move You Make. And then I got together a lot of poems I'd had for quite a long time and produced a book, Typewriter Music. And then I thought, well, maybe I will go back again and look at this book, Ransom. And that's when I took it to a publisher and it got published. The book has astonished me because, in a way that I could never have predicted, it has been extraordinarily popular. And huge numbers of people have read the book. And I still ask myself quite what it is in the book that readers who wouldn't necessarily be interested in this material have been drawn to. And I have come to the conclusion that it's because it's a book that presents itself very simply as a story. And that one of the things it's about is about storytelling, and it's about the kinds of stories we tell and why we tell those stories and what storytelling means to us. And I've always believed that storytelling was one of those absolutely human activities that fulfills an absolutely human need. And it's interesting, perhaps, to consider that, if that was true in primitive times when people sat down and listened to a professional storyteller, and if people went on doing that for thousands of years in non-literate places, and if we all sat at our mother's knee and listened to short stories being told, somehow there is something in that activity itself that deeply appeals to us and that we feel we need. And that one of the things that Bill and I perhaps might talk about. The actual subject of the book really does go back, and it's in the afterwards, so I won't explain it and tell it again. But, I first heard that I was a reader, but at 9, for some reason, I had never, although I'd read several Dickens novels, I'd never actually come across the Troy story. And I heard that one afternoon, rainy afternoon, when we should have been out playing tunnel ball, couldn't do it, and the teacher decided to read us something, and she read to us from the Iliad, a children's version of it. And I was devastated because the story didn't finish. The bell rang and then we all went home. And I wanted to know what happened. I didn't know then, in fact, that the Iliad itself ends on something like an unfinished note. Why it all meant so much to me was because this was 1943 and I was living in Brisbane and we were living in a city in which every building was sandbagged and which what we were doing was waiting for the invading army to come with no knowledge then, because history hadn't yet happened, that we were not going to suffer the same kind of fate that the Trojans suffered. So when I heard that story, it wasn't a fairy story. It was a story that touched absolutely on my own kinds of anxieties and fears. So that's one of the reasons why several times in writing I've gone back to the Troy material. And one of the things is, I think, again, that material is itself something that speaks to people over and over again in different ages about certain kinds of essential and primitive anxieties about the fall of the city. The city is a sacred construct which represents the best of everything in us in terms of civil behaviour and civil aspirations, and the fall of a city is a terrible, terrible thing. So, you know, that is material itself which strikes us deeply. Going back to the actual Iliad, I didn't really want to retell what's, after all, a classically told and unmatchable work. I mean, we sometimes forget that 27 centuries ago, at the very beginning of our literate culture, this work appeared, and in my terms, has actually never been matched by anything that has been written since. There are great books, and Shakespeare, you know, with all his work, might stand beside it, but actually I know of no single work that is as great and casts such a long shadow as the Iliad. So there's no reason to tell it again. What I was interested in is if there weren't some little places in that telling where things are not told, which one could now begin to tell. And one of those things is the story of Priam's childhood, which doesn't appear anywhere else as far as I know. And the other thing was to look again at that heroic world, and without, and you know, the Iliad is built entirely on that notion of the hero and of a heroic world in operation. To look again at that material, and without really wanting to write a work that was anti-heroic or mock-heroic, nevertheless, because we don't really need such things, write a work that was non-heroic, and to take this heroic material and present it in some kind of non-heroic way. And that really was to look at Priam and see his kind of heroism, which is a kind of moral and imaginative heroism, as being the equal, or in fact more important than the heroism of an Ajax or an Achilles. Because it is another kind of human action that he's being heroic in. And the other thing was to sneak into that world where he could never appear and never have a voice, someone who is clearly there but never actually appears in Homer's Iliad, and that is somebody like the character I've called Somax, who's sort of an ordinary working man going on with an ordinary life. And then by putting him side by side with Priam, to see what that might allow us to see about how you might talk about Priam in a different way. So that's what I was trying to do. The thing I would say about that is that the novel is constructed quite simply, a bit like a classical French play, to this extent that it's about a single confrontation in the end between Achilles and Priam. And really what the book is setting out to do is to provide you with enough knowledge of both of those characters and their situation to make the dramatic moment when it comes fully accessible to you. But I also took the advantage of the Priam-Somax relationship and that journey to write in the middle of it a kind of small comic pastoral, which is what that journey becomes. And also in doing that, to do something that belongs peculiarly to the novel. Because when I say a French drama, you know, a French drama is based on strict Aristotelian principles. You know, takes place in a single time, which the book does. It's about a single event, which is the book does. And in Aristotelian terms, everything should be irrelevant. But the novel is a form that was invented to take advantage of the interesting and appealing and ultimately wonderful irrelevancies of ordinary life. And so it really is a kind of hymn to praise, particularly in that middle section, to what Nabokov would call lovely irrelevancy. You know, and he says himself that that's the place where the novel discovers its greatest truths. So it's a book which is also about the novel itself. perhaps I won't read so that we can have our conversation, but it might be that some point in the conversation, we can find an opportunity for reading.
Right. That gets rid of about half of my questions. Thanks very much. You've explained how the interest that the Iliad has for you. I'm just curious, where else have you talked about Troy in your work? Where has it cropped up?
There are a couple of poems. There's a poem called Decade's End, which refers to Troy. There's a poem which is about that moment of hearing that story for the first time, and it's called Episode from an Early War, and it's quoted in part in the afterword there. Then a few years ago, when I wrote a little book called Untold Tales, I told 2 Greek stories in that. One is a version of the Achilles Patroclus situation where Patroclus goes out in disguise. And I've played around with that in a completely unjustified by any Greek thing concerned, because what happens there is that Odysseus is the person who suggests it, and he suggests that Patroclus will be playing a trick on the army. But of course what he's actually doing is, by becoming a kind of simulacrum and going out there, he's not only calling into question the whole sort of honour thing, but he's really cutting away the ground under anybody who would want to present themselves heroically ever again. So there's that. That's a very kind of postmodern piece. And maybe that's it.
Yeah, I suppose everyone looks at the Priam Achilles encounter as central, but I think there's something else going on. I looked at the film Troy in preparing for this conversation, and that was probably a really bad idea, because it's full of
bad film.
It's full of bloodshed and violence and beautiful women and what Peter Conrad calls Brad Pitt's fantastically sculpted buttocks.
Yeah.
And I think that in a way it was good to look at that. This is what spectacle can do with a big story. But what happens with Ransom is you go immediately into the minutiae, what you call the irrelevancies, but it seemed to me immediately that this is a book about what the novel can do.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
And so I wonder if that's the way you see the novel developing, because in fact, as it develops, there's something else happens. It's not the story of Priam and Achilles doesn't seem to me to be the centre of the book. I'll talk to that in a minute. But before we do, I just want to go and talk a little bit about poetry and the language of poetry. When I was a student and you were a lecturer, you were a poet. And
Only.
This was before Jono was published in 1975, so that gives you an idea how long ago it was. But I would say that there is possibly nobody and no Australian author anyway, who employs poetic language in fiction so well. I mean, the economy, the rhythm, and in lines like, when Achilles is standing over Hector, he's cut his ankles, his heels, and he says he was waiting for the rage to fill him. That would be equal to the outrage he was committing. And I think these lines are poetry, they're poetic. And what you might want to refer to that review I made many years ago, but let me ask this question. Are you a better poet as a novelist than you are as a poet?
Oh, I don't know. Look, I think that's for other people to decide.
Stop.
No, that's something for other people to decide. But I think I don't myself see that when people say somebody's a poetic prose writer, that's necessarily. That's just describing one of the kind of prose that can exist. But it is often used as a sort of put down, I think. I'm not suggesting you're doing that.
No.
But all that means, and the language that you use in prose is never really like that of poetry, because the language of poetry is much, much more dense, and you're asked to read it in a much different way. And it comes certainly in a very different way when you're writing it. But all that can mean inside a prose work is that you want the words to have the same kind of individual and immediate reverberation that they would have in a poem. And you want the language to be musical in a way that it would be in a poem. And I don't know, I can't tell whether that means that people have to read in a different way, whether they have to read more slowly, whether they you wouldn't want to hold them up so much in getting through the sentences that they were not actually following the action. Now, all of those are problems for the person who's writing the book. The only way he'll ever know whether he solved them or not is in what the reader experiences. But I mean, when you're writing a poem, you're really trying to slow down very, very much the reader's apprehension of a sentence, of a line, of a cadence, through a line. You don't really want to do that in prose, but so you still want it to move on as fast as it can, and to embody action, but it doesn't seem to me a bad thing if along the way the words get loaded enough for that experience to be a rich one.
I think that's really a good point, because I think that economy of language that poetry brings is perfect for what you're trying to do in the novel, in going below the big story, to see the minutiae. And immediately when you get into the novel, Achilles is a person. He's not a hero from classical legend. He's a person who longs for his mother. Just this line, he was 5, then 6. She was his secret. He floated in the long, soft swirlings of her hair. And in lines like that, you get the sense of real humanity. And that's what I think you talk about irrelevancies and the minutiae, but it's the humanity that I think is really powerful there. And I want to think about, you said you wrote it in 2002. Now, I'll just throw this in, but one reviewer has suggested that the contemporary significance of the Greek tribes invading the sophisticated metropolis of Troy is like is to liken the 4 square towers of Troy to the World Trade Center. And so, is there is that resonance there, do you think, or is it just drawing too long a bow? Is it going too far-fetched?
I think it's very difficult when you're a writer to know to what extent events out there in the world have actually shaped what you're doing. I read a lot of novels these days, especially American novels, and what they're often about is a man dying of cancer, usually prostate cancer. And nevertheless, I find myself saying this is a post 9/11 novel. What this novel is really about is about the trauma of the loss of everything from inside. And so it's true, I think, that events like that, like once say the Holocaust happened, not when it happened, but many years afterwards when it got into people's consciousness, I think it had a huge effect on the kinds of books that people wrote and the kind of poetry they wrote. But it's very difficult because often those things are displaced. And what you're getting is not dealing with the thing directly at all, but dealing with it indirectly through the kind of traumatic emotion it's created in people. So I can't say. Maybe if the first time around it was about about the Japanese invasion of Brisbane, which never happened, it might well be that working on that material in 2002, one of the things that drew me to it was the sight of those towers falling, because that's the moment. It's for us in the most extraordinary way in 21st century. It's the visual picture of a plane going into those two buildings and they're crumbling and falling that is the real key to our emotion, rather than the thought that all these people are dying. I think for the physical disintegration in real time of something that we're looking at, it was just an extraordinary thing. So maybe.